Conversation with HR and
Chat with you.
they've recommended.
Good morning. I want to welcome you all to our presentation today on ungrading. Before we get started, I just want to remind if you could sign into the chat with your full name and the institution name, that would be great. I know we still have some folks coming in. I want to introduce myself. My name is Nadine Edwards, and I am the Director of E-Learning Services at Prince George's Community College. But one of the many things I do is I serve as a board member for Maryland Online, who is sponsoring this webinar today. And I would like to introduce our presenter and then turn it over to him. I would like to welcome David Buck. He is a professor at Howard Community College who will be presenting today. His interests include writing assessment, feedback practices, ungrading, mastery, learning, and open pedagogy. So he has a wide variety of things he's interested in. He holds a master's degree in education from Temple University. So I'd like to welcome him, and I will stop sharing my screen so David can start sharing his. During the presentation, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. If there is a natural place to pause in the middle of the presentation, we may do some questions then. Otherwise, we will hold those questions to the end. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadine. And thank you for the folks at Maryland Online for having me back. I'm going to put the link to my slides in the chat, if that's okay with everyone. Nadine, if you can, hold on a second here. It's tiny URL. Sorry, I should have had this prepared. There you go. And I think if some people come in late, Nadine, they don't see the chat. So if you want to just re-up that link again throughout, that would be great.
No, I'd be glad to do that. I've had that drama, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Like they're like, there's nothing in the chat. I'm like,
right.
No.
That's for the folks who want to follow along. So thank you. So I am actually going to talk about something that is very interesting at this time of the semester, since and thank you so much for attending, those of you who are here. I know that a Thursday at the end of the semester can be quite stressful, so thank you for taking the time to join us today. What I'd like to do, first of all, is just talk about myself in a sense that, hold on a second. There it is. I always bring this disclaimer up when I'm presenting. I am basically nobody, so take my words with a grain of salt. I'm just a hack. I have a high tolerance for failure. So what I'm going to do today is tell you about my experiences going with a gradeless classroom. In no way am I challenging or criticizing anyone else's approach to assessment. Whatever you do in your classrooms is great. I'm sure you're very effective. I'm just going to share my experiences experimenting with a gradeless classroom. And again, I am continually learning and failing. So, and I also want to say that this is more of a learning experience for me every time I present on this topic, simply because I learn every day about what assessment does and what it can do with our students. So I'd like to just first of all, try to define what is ungrading. And ungrading is kind of like this ubiquitous term that has been co-opted and used by others. And I just want to say, this is what I think ungrading is. It's basically a philosophy. It's an approach that seeks to decenter the control-based function of grades. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And if we can decenter grades to focus on the learning process and divorce that process from the stress and anxiety that grades bring, that's a good thing. So for me, I focus on the learning process as the key element of my courses. And I teach English composition and literature. Most likely, I teach composition. So what we like to do with my students is to talk about agency, charting internal and external growth, taking risks in our learning. So the whole big thing is up at the top there, process over product. Too much for me of my assessment was focused on outcomes and production rather than the process and experience of learning. And I came to this realization in around 2014. I've been doing a gradeless assessment since then. And I thought to myself, there has to be a better way. Instead of just continuing to oppress my students with traditional grading. A lot of what I've heard was, well, you're preparing them for the real world. You have to have strict standards. You have to have these expectations because that's what they need in their job. And what I thought about that is, well, if that's true in the real world and that's oppressive, why am I oppressing them now to prepare them for a future oppression? So it didn't make sense to me. So this is how I came to the world of being gradeless. And I started thinking about how my students associate themselves with grades. So every time I see my students in the beginning of the semester, I do a quick little poll. And I ask them this question: how do you feel when you hear the words or the phrase, this will be graded? And most likely, and they type in their responses, and this system that I use produces a word cloud. And the number one highest used, highest ranked word is stress, and all the other associated traumas with stress. This has been true for me for many, many years. Every time I do this exercise, I could probably replicate this word cloud over and over and over again. And you think about these things: panic, nervousness, failing, bro. I like that one. It's, this idea of all of these social, emotional feelings that are raised with this word, this phrase, this will be graded. Now, if learning is a cognitive exercise, this should not be the case. Instead, learning is a personal, social, emotional construct. And when we fail to recognize that, I think we do more harm to our students. The other thing I ask my students is to respond to these, whether they agree or disagree with these statements. I've enjoyed my writing in school. Most of them are pretty okay with that. They kind of disagree, but it's on the disagree side. I'm confident in my writing. That moves up to the agree, 3.3. And then I take risks in my learning and don't mind failing, 2.7, again, on the low side. So what does this show me? This shows me that my students come to my classes with some pretty good confidence in their writing ability. However, they've been beaten down and punished and criticized by traditional assessments where they don't take risks because grades punish mistakes, and they don't enjoy their writing in their. So they did the exercise, they're confident, but did they enjoy it? Did they actually have some meaningful experience with that writing? So this is a really interesting, and this usually slates every semester that I put this poll up, which is very, very interesting. So what is the issue with traditional grading? Well, just to put it in and I'm not talking about we should get rid of all grades. Now, I have to be honest here. I do have to apply a final grade to meet my contractual obligations to my institution. However, how we arrive at that final grade is what I'm going to pitch today. What I have found in my experience, grades are very transactional and very, very inequitable. And the idea here is that they do something, I then apply the grade. So it's kind of compliance based. It's arbitrary. It's this idea that I want to be efficient in my grading because I have 22 students in every section. I teach so many sections. I need to produce uniformity for my own sanity. But it's based on sentiments of scarcity, competition. Instead of collaborating, if there are only so many A's to be, if my dean or whoever is evaluating me looks at my grade distribution, there's that encouragement for professors to have some good showing in each of the grades. Couple A's, couple B's, C's, that's a effective instructor. And so even for me, it encourages uniformity in my own assessment. Grades are stressful. Anxiety, and you saw that word cloud. It encourages caution over risk taking, and this idea that cheating is a sidebar to traditional grading. Most of our students who cheat or plagiarize or do whatever, it's usually if you drill down into that motivation for that whatever discretion, it's usually because of a lack of time, responsibilities, didn't understand the content. It's usually not a student who says, I will now cheat at this assessment just because I like to do it. It's usually some other parameter or factor that goes into that. And to me, traditional grading just encourages that. Finally, traditional grades I found are arbitrary and inaccurate. They are wildly inconsistent across disciplines. Even in my own English discipline, if we ever get all of us professors get into a room to do a norming session, we're wildly all over the place, arguing over whether this essay is a C, a B, an A. And so it's basically traditional grades are subjective, but they have the plausibility of objectivity. It's really objectivity theater in my mind. And so we say to ourselves, well, I have these rubrics, I have all of these outcomes. This is what the students are being graded against. They're being graded against these standards. And that's not true. We grade based on our position as professors. So there's a power dynamic there. And what do students do? They're smart. They say, well, if this is the person that's assigning the grade, I'm going to write for that person. I'm going to study for that person. I'm trying to try to perform for that person rather than for me as a student, for my learning, for something that will change my life as a result of this educational experience that I'm having. One of the greatest voices of the problems of traditional grading is Alfie Kohn, and he talks about that when research is applied to assessments, when students are graded, they tend to think less deeply, they avoid taking risks, and they lose interest in learning itself. And these are the things that we don't want to have happen in our classes, right? We want them to be deep thinkers. We want them to take risks, be curious, pursue their interests. And in a sense, we shoot ourselves in the foot by having these wonderful objectives that we want to have happen, but then we reduce the power of those objectives by traditionally grading. Jesse Stommel's another big voice, and he talks about grading as emphasizing efficiency over the needs of an individual learner. And so when I give a grade, and I used to do this, I was more interested in defending that grade rather than making sure my grades were equitable. And so I said to myself, yeah, but I'm not just grading. I'm giving comments. I'm giving feedback to my students. But most of my feedback, if I go back and look at that, the feedback was actually to defend the letter grade. And so it was more for me rather than trying to help that student grow in his or her or their learning experiences or their writing growth. But what about motivation, right? Grades are good external motivators, right? And that research can show that. But motivation is a tricky subject. In fact, it's one of the most important factors we have that we can target for learning. And we think about what motivates our students. And I found this out in my 23 years of teaching in college, is that I cannot give motivation. It must come from the student. I can try to externally motivate them, but that is not sustainable. Grades as external motivators are not sustainable. They'll fizzle out towards the progression of that student's experience. So we have to think about other ways of motivation. And this is one of the, Peter Senge talks about this as intrinsic motivation is the thing we want to tap into, right? And students are born with this. Dignity, curiosity to learn, joy in learning. You don't need to observe a kindergarten class to notice that those kids tend to have fun. They're active, their engagement. And what do we know in our research? That the level of engagement in learning decreases the longer a student is in school. Schooling destroys motivation. And the forces of these destructive things start right in the beginning of school. Grades, stickers, stars, all of this through until they get to us in colleges and universities. And so students are coming into our courses already trained by traditional grading and assessment to perform the way they perform. This then filters into our assessment approaches, right? And so we have these deadlines, these inflexible policies, these rubrics that are clear, concise, and that is going to produce learning. In fact, that only produces this idea that learning is uniformed, and it is not. Learning is contextual. Each student needs his or her or their own ways of approaching the subject. And then we think about, well, all you need is motivation. performed by a deadline, performed by meeting some arbitrary standard or rubric, right? And that's not then motivation. That is compliance. So do grades motivate students? And if we look at the research, the answer is no. Grades actually thwart the psychological needs of students and academic motivation. In fact, narrative evaluations with actionable feedback are better. They promote trust and cooperation. I love this finding because it really hits to what drew me to a gradeless classroom. And that is, I want to have relations with the learning of my students. I want to have that relationship over than just them performing for me. I want them to cooperate and collaborate rather than see each other as competition, right? Because there's only so many A's in this course. So I'm going to have to fight these other folks to get to that A. So instead of relationships, we have compliance. We have this idea of competition and scarcity. This is very interesting because when we think about feedback applied with a grade, I used to think that was the way to go, as I talked about before. But research in the 80s by Ruth Butler talks about how feedback is not effective when it's accompanied by a grade. Why? Students focus on the grade, not on the feedback. So if we divorce the feedback from the grade, that feedback gains power. And this is kind of what I'm going to get into with my approach to gradeless learning. So what are some ungrading approaches? And folks, I've tried all of these and I've failed at all of these. And I'm going to tell you where I am today since 2014 to today and what I'm using for an ungrading approach. So we can focus on metacognition and self-assessment. We can get a little bit more complex and move into mastery-based learning. We can then move into more of a hands-off approach where the student is fully, an agent in their learning by labor-based grading. And then this is my little term for what I'm doing, which is the labor reflex approach. So if we think about metacognition, what we can think about is using reflective practice in our courses. Focus on the process of learning, that formative assessment, instead of that summative assessment. Ask our students to self-assess, focus on their strengths, areas for improvement. Maybe have them describe the work that best reflects their learning. Ask them how they are feeling with the feedback. Is that building trust with our students? And metacognition is a great way of leading our students into this self-assessment. What is self-assessment? I want my students to develop an internal locus of assessment. The ability to look at their work and say, this is good. This works for me. This isn't it's not doing what I want it to do. I have to change it. I have to revise it. This failed. What can I learn from this failure, this mistake? And then redo it and redo it. And that's what formative assessment is, right? It's failing, it's trying, failing, getting feedback, trying again, and having the space and freedom to do that rather than this is it. This assessment is all the marbles. If I mess up on this assessment, my grade is sunk, right? And when I'm thinking that way, I'm thinking in survival mode instead of thinking about being a deep learner rather than a strategic learner who just needs to memorize the formulas, regurgitate it, and get the hell out of there, right? The next thing that I've tried is mastery-based learning. And I call this mastering-based learning because there is no terminal mastery in writing, or at least in my discipline. We're constantly learning, constantly iterating in our ability to communicate through the written word. So I used mastery-based learning and I took away grades, but I made a 4-point scale. Okay, exceeding mastery, meeting mastery, approaching mastery or nearing it, and then not meeting it. And what I found is when I would have my grading conferences with my students, my assessment conferences, they would tend to focus on the 1, 2, 3, 4. I have a 2. How do I get to a 3? And I went, oh, this isn't working. They're just replacing the 1, 2, 3, 4. They just replaced the ABCD with the 1, 2, 3, 4. and so it didn't work for me. However, it gave me some really good lessons in assessments, which is turning over the power of assessment to the student. What evidence can you provide? Okay, you don't like my assessment, this assignment. what's another way that you can demonstrate your learning, and how do you want to demonstrate that? We talked about learning as the fixed thing, not not the time. So instead of at October 20th, you all must know this amount of content. No, we made learning as the fixed thing that's going to have to happen. Time is the variable. And so I started to implement flexible, what I would call best by dates. I have an assignment, I have a due date, but it's a best by due date, which means this is like a carton of milk. It's best if used by this date. So I say to the students, it's best if you can get this in at this time, because I've focused my whole schedule, my calendar around giving you feedback at this time for this assignment. However, there are no penalties or lowering of grades or points, because I don't have grades, if you turn it in late. Life happens. So that flexibility to say, at the end of the semester, we want these learning targets to be met. How we get there, how long it takes to get there, that's a flexible thing. That's a variable. Okay. And I love this quote, which is, mastery is all about the reaching. It's not the arrival. And that's what learning is, right? Learning is the journey, not the destination. But yet we have these systems in place in education where that's not true. We have 15 weeks, or if you're in a 7-week term or a quarter system, you have to have all this learned by this amount of time. And so it's this mixed messaging that we have with our students. I love this quote about mastery, which is, the learning should drive the mastery, not the marks, the scores, the grades, right? So we want to focus on feedback that is focused on improving skills rather than getting that final A grade. Improving the skills means there has to be space, opportunity to try, fail, get feedback, try again. And so resubmissions, redos are a big part of my assessment approach. Then I move to labor-based grading. Labor-based grading says this: if the student does this amount of labor, that's the A grade. If they do this amount of labor, that's the B grade, and so forth. And what the idea here is that labor is something the students can control. They can't control some of the trauma they've been through. And you talk about the trauma-informed pedagogy, all of the harms associated with learning that students have come. What labor-based says is, okay, it's now based on what you do. And so there's agency, trust. We can negotiate the amount of labor tied to the final letter grade. This values the labor involved in learning. And if you think about it, all that studying for that exam, or all that preparation for that lab report, or all of the thinking rumination that I had to go through to write that essay, that's all discounted by traditional grades, because there's the rubric, there's my score. And so the professor never considered everything that went into that, the meaningful work, the thinking, the producing, the learning, all of that went into that product. Shouldn't that have value? And so the labor-based grading seeks to honor that. The key here is that a lot of folks say, well, labor-based grading, that sounds transactional. Well, not if it's focused on the relationships in the learning process. Relationships are not transactional in this approach. Instead, students maintain control over their commitments, and that remains agile. And so for a lot of labor-based graders, they'll stop at the midterm and ask their students, are you still okay with the contract that you committed to? So let's say you committed to the A grade contract, and now you found life is happening. You're going to have to bump it down to the B. Okay, there's room to do that. There's agility there, flexibility for that. Vice versa, right? Vice versa. The student who signed up for the C now says, "Wait a second, I'm performing here. I'm really enjoying this learning. I want to bump my contract up to the A grade." That also can be. So there's a vice versa there as well. Here's why I abandoned the full-on labor-based grading contracts as my gradeless approach, is that I found that some students that had outside factors and responsibilities wanted to commit to the labor for the A grade, but just didn't have the time. And so I felt that those students were being insufficiently motivated or even punished because they had to take care of an ailing parent, or they had to work 40 hours a week. So what I arrived at is this approach where I'm not going to focus on just grading and all of that associated harm that goes with it. I'm going to focus on my feedback and encouragement. So I adopted what I've called positive attention. I read a book called 9 Lies About Work by Marcus Buckingham, the guy that did the Strengths Finder survey. And their lie number 5 is that people need feedback. And that struck me as very, very interesting because I'm all about feedback because I don't use grades. But what they found is the research found that feedback, when it's negative, incites the sympathetic nervous system. And that sympathetic nervous system is the system that helped us survive the lions and the bears and all those dangers. It was the fight or flight. And so what they've found is that negative feedback incites students' sympathetic nervous system. So they're either going to fight it or flee, run away. And what they found is that when students received positive attention, or workers received positive attention, it actually incited their parasympathetic nervous system, the well and dwell system. And that led to more cognitive openness, the ability to feel seen, recognized, and that led to better performance. So I said to myself, wow, this is interesting. Maybe I can focus on encouraging my students, actually give them feedback as a human being, not as an evaluator or a ranker or a judge. I'm going to just look at their blog posts and say, wow, this resonated with me, or this reminded me of my childhood, or I love this soundtrack that you're talking about, the soundtrack of your life. I love that song when I was growing up in the 80s. And so it's this idea of recognizing the good that they're doing in hopes that they'll replicate that flow in future writings, in future abilities and assignments. And so that's the idea of that well and dwell, because I am way more open to learning if I feel safe. I am not going to learn if I'm in a heightened sense of stress where I'm either going to fight my professor or flee from the class, not even come or not even submit that assignment. So what I came up with is this labor reflex. So I merged a little bit of everything that I just talked to you about. So I focus on trust, agency, reflection, positive attention, equity, and community. So what I tried to do is give my students the ability to say, here's the labor. And if you want to labor in this class, we're going to focus on producing enough evidence of your learning that you can self-assess. So we practice that because, as you know, many of our students have never been asked to reflect or self-assess. So I can't assume that they know how to do that. I can't even do that sometimes. Okay, so it's a skill that is a developing skill, not a terminal mastery, right? Skill. So we talk about the default labor of the class, okay, with opportunities for them to control their labor and use best by due dates and all of that. So we focus on the labor itself, the scope, intensity, and meaning from their labor. So I asked them in some reflections, what's the scope of your labor thus far? How intense were you? Because some students will find that they can be intensely laboring in an hour instead of working on 8 hours. And we have this weird construct that they have to come to my class an hour and 20 minutes twice a week for learning to occur. Learning can occur anywhere, and it can be intense or it can be drawn out. I give that up to the students. And then I ask them, what's the meaning that you derived from your learning? So at the end of the semester, they are going to, and I'm reading through them right now, they're going to produce a final assessment form where I ask them to reflect on their learning growth and how they charted their learning goals and how well they met the targets that we produced about English 121 in the course. And then they determine their final grade with me in an assessment conversation. Okay, not an assessment monologue where I graded, averaged, and all that stuff that goes on the grade book. I asked them to come up with the grade. Now, the reaction I usually get is, well, then anyone can just say the A. Well, not really, because in that self-assessment, they have to actually reflect on the evidence that they've produced. No evidence means nothing to reflect upon, means I cannot self-assess. And so a student who did not do the labor of the course doesn't really have the ability to accurately self-assess. Okay. And so that is my way of saying this is important because it's meaningful to you and to me to learn about yourself as a writer, to develop that voice. The other concern is, well, what happens if a student says they have an A and you disagree with that? Well, this rarely happens, believe it or not. In my years of doing this, most of the time, students will downgrade themselves. And I have to actually say, I disagree with that respectfully. I think you were at the A level. Why are you giving yourself a C? And usually those are marginalized students, minority students, and female students that do that. And it's very interesting. And so for me, part of my goal, unspoken and spoken, is to produce confident learners. If you can leave my class a little bit more confident in your writing ability, hey, I take that as a win. I don't care about grades. I care about whether you're confident enough in your skills and you feel like you've been heard and your voice has been heard. And so my ultimate goal is for students to reflexively labor with mindfulness. And that's that reflex, which is I'm going to labor, but I'm not laboring for the grade. I'm not laboring just to get this done so I can get the hell out of here. I'm not laboring in the sense of I'm playing the game of school. This is what I have to do to get the grade that I want. So I'm going to do that quick as possible. And this is where we get the AI problems, the generative AI. If generative AI can produce a facsimile of academic writing that my students can do, that's a problem with me. That's the problem with my assessment approach. And that's a problem with my, and really assessment can illuminate learning. Oh, believe me, it can, but it can also bury learning under arbitrary standards, rubrics, and this encouragement to mimic. And a lot of our students write through mimicry. They've realized that this is the way I should sound to get that A grade, because that's what the language of the academy wants me to do. Instead of saying, here's my voice, David, I'm going to express my voice about this topic that interests me, and I want you to hear me, right? And so that's what I'm trying to get them to do. Labor with mindfulness, with this mindset that I'm doing this labor to grow. And I'm doing this labor because I trust David's going to recognize it, rather than beat me down with, a bunch of marginal notations where I didn't do. And by the way, students assume feedback is already colored with negativity. They do. They already, and they've been doing that all their writing life, is doing writing assignments and then getting a bunch of bad news about their writing and how they made all these errors. So now they write through error avoidance rather than writing to deeply learn about something that they're writing about. And this is where, when I was a student and I said to my, did that professor even read what I was saying? All right. And so I try to recognize that, because if I can recognize what the student is doing, they feel seen, and I get to talk about where they are when they're their most excellent self. And then we can say, how can we replicate that in another blog post? Or how can we replicate that in another course where you have to write a paper? And so that gives us that sense that there is potential in learning. There's opportunity in learning. So, of course, I'm going to cherry pick my student comments about this. And I asked them about and I'm just, putting this up there, that some students talk about, and I have their permission to share this with you, but some students talk about how it's been a nice experience to be in my class, to actually experience that learning process rather than just working towards a grade. And of course, I'm cherry picking, right? There are students that have an issue with ungrading, and I have to be very careful about the way that I introduce it, because what am I doing when I remove the grade? I'm removing an anchor point for some of my students, a harbor in the sea of learning, that they at least know that's what that A is, even though it's built on subjectivity, it's built on BS, it's a plausibility of objectivity. Right? But these grades don't mean anything, because what's the difference between an A and a C? Does that say a C person can't do something that an A person can? And so this is that idea of unmooring that from the student. And so I have to make sure that my support system wraps around them and says, trust me on this. I'm trying this different. It's different than you've ever been. And what I normally find in their final self-assessments is that there's skepticism at the beginning of the semester, and that turns to trust, and then full endorsement at the end, where most students say, you know what, I really, and then the fun part is when they can talk about this idea of, do they miss grades? And I ask them, did you miss grades in this? And a lot of them will say, no, I don't miss the anxiety, that performance anxiety of trying to perform for a student or a teacher for a particular grade. And that really, and we know that, right? When we observe something, the thing that which is observed changes because of the observation. It changes the thing that is being observed. When we are observed in our teaching, it's a different feel. It's a different, even a different culture, a different energy in the room when there's someone in the back observing us in our teaching. So, now think about that as a student through 5 courses with 5 different observers with 5 different ideas of what is an A grade. My God, insanity. The cool thing that I like about some of my students is that they can transfer their experiences in a gradeless class. And this is one of the comments. I think I'm going to try to use this philosophy in other classes because the grades will follow if you focus on the learning material. I just read a self-assessment this morning that actually mirrored this very same concept, this very same idea, which is I'm going to take my other courses, even though they're not gradeless, I'm going to assume that I'm not being graded and see how my performance changes. Wonderful. That's wonderful. And I'm not, this is not rainbows and blue skies. I am saying to my students, you will take professors that have stringent policies, grading policy, take off 5 points for a missing comma. You're going to meet that. But are you going to be affected by that? Transfer that trauma into something that you can actually use. And so instead of saying, I'm not going to internalize those grades, they don't define me. What defines me is my ability to learn, to get up, and to keep moving forward. That's what's going to, characterize my learning. And that's a beautiful thing. So if you're going to dip your toes into ungrading, right? And you say to yourself, okay, what's something that I can do at this moment? Well, one, try incorporating self-assessment after assignments. Go ahead, give your exam, give your points, give all that stuff. But maybe one assignment, ask the students to self-assess, to say, did this assignment actually give them the ability to reflect or project or demonstrate their learning? 2, maybe if you can collaborate with your students on the learning targets for a specific task, invite them into the assessment conversation. And really, assessment comes from the Latin word that means to sit beside, to sit beside. And so sit beside them, listen to their voices. 3, maybe use minimal grades instead of these arbitrary, I used to have these rubrics that had 12 performance indicators because I wanted to defend my grade. And so instead of that, do minimal things like a 1, 2, 3, 4, or this is what an A would mean, this is what a B would mean, and keep it short. So that they can see that there's a minimal centering of the grade. 4, maybe emphasize formative practice over summative assessments. All right, give that ability to try, fail, try again. Think about mastery-based learning in the way that you produce your content. And then maybe number 5, try to employ ungrading maybe for a small, low risk, low stakes assignment or activity. And just say to them, okay, for this assignment, we're not going to use grades. I'm just going to ask you to reflect and assess and see what they think. See how you feel from doing that. Jesse Stommel gives this in a slide in many of his presentations under a Creative Commons license, which is this things that you could do tomorrow if you wanted to. I love these. 1, change the way you talk about assessment. Don't use words like required, submit. Maybe say, I ask you or invite you to do this. Center the students rather than yourself. So change the way you talk about your assessments. 2, invite them into conversations about grades. One of my first annotation assignments is a blog post about the meaning of grades. So I introduced this conversation about that early in the semester. And maybe we can talk about how grades affect their motivation, how they feel when they're being assessed or evaluated through grades. 3, grade less stuff, grade less often. Maybe have them do some work that is not graded, where you just say, I want you to do it, and then I want you to assess on it. We have this mindset, and sometimes I have to deal with this, is that if my eyes don't rest on the student's work, it doesn't count. It didn't have value. That's so egotistical in my pedagogy. It's really confidence that is misinformed. And so what I say to the students is there are some things in this class that you will do, and I'm going to ask you to labor on, but I'm not going to look at. These are for you. Okay. And maybe think about that as a way of introducing this decentering of the grade. And then finally, ask students to reflect on their own learning. And we do a lot about this. And like I talked to you about before, we might have to model this for our students, or at least guide them through what reflection is. I've found that I do reflections through Google Forms, but I make my questions very specific. So I don't just say, how did you feel about this? I'm very specific about the labor that they performed and what meaning and intensity and scope that they derived from that. A little bit of my own grading philosophy. This is what I've posted on social media. This is it in a nutshell. I try to place my students at the center of the assessment process. That's a hard thing to do because I've been trained to center myself. I am the expert in the classroom. I'm supposed to, produce my knowledge and filter it through whatever I'm doing to them. Instead, ask my students to gauge their learning. It's been wonderful. And then to trust them when they do that, because they know that information. They realize what, and I'm reading these self-assessments this week, and many of them are saying, because I was doing something for myself, I worked harder on that assignment. I worried about my communicative abilities and whether it was effective. I asked my friends and family to read my blog post before I posted it because I looked at my peer assessments and thought about those comments the next time I did the next blog. So it's that idea of there is a whole world in that student that we have. There's an entire world, and we have to recognize that. Unlimited redos and resubmissions. I don't use grades, and I give feedback that's centered on positive attention. Unlimited redos and resubmissions. How do you do that? 15 weeks. You're still accepting stuff. What I found is that students, when they start developing that locus of assessment, that internalized framework, they don't need as many redos and resubmissions. And the only time they're resubmitting something is if they didn't meet the labor requirements. And I say, oh, I'm sorry, we want to do this. This is the labor for this assessment. You didn't do all of the labor. Could you go back and finish that out? And then that's the redo and the resubmission. Okay. Again, this works for me. I'm not, saying that this works in every learning context. Students can learn without grades. They can't learn without feedback. This has been my mantra throughout my career, which is they need that relationship of learning for talking about what we're learning in the class. I don't want to produce surface learners, strategic learners. I want to produce deep learners, learners that can walk away from my class with more confidence and the ability to continue iterating their work, their growth. There is no magic key to ungrading. I cannot say, here's the turnkey solution, do this tomorrow and everything will be great. It's a constant progress into unlocking what gradeless learning means to me and to my students. And there is this concept that, well, if you're not doing this, you're not ungrading. I throw that out the window. I say, do whatever you think is pedagogically effective that fits your pedagogical approach and your belief system. Do that, because that's your moral compass. And for me, for all those years I was grading, something didn't feel right inside my being. It was almost like a moral, ethical thing. And I always ask myself, how did all these people find ungrading? When I talk about the ungrading community that's big in social media, we all found ourselves because there was something lacking in our pedagogy. There's something that wasn't right. And what we found is this feels better. This feels right because I'm not oppressing my students. And that's been my mantra, is do no harm. Try to do no harm to your students. And finally, I make light of this at the end of the semester, with grading and ungrading, but really, folks, the trauma of grading is felt by us as well. Do not think that we escape the trauma and the associated harm of grading. It hits us as well. And that's something that is very interesting to me. Here are some resources for me. If you go through the online link to my presentations on beautiful AI. This is all of my links for you. I just want to focus on the top right. I have an ungrading liquid syllabus that I give to my students in the first week. That is how because one of the questions is, how do you introduce this approach to your students? That's how I do it. And so I write this liquid syllabus that talks about my ungrading approach, and then I invite the conversations afterwards. But these are all of the resources that I've informed my practice, and I hope that they're helpful to you. If you want to contact me, those are my contact information. If you want to, tell me what you're doing so I can learn from you, that would be greatly appreciated as well. And I hope that this was a meaningful conversation for you. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for that passionate and wonderful presentation that really gave me some different perspectives. I do actually have a son who has had some learning challenges, disability many years, and I understand. It's always nice to hear different ways that how the system sometimes provides feedback that doesn't always help them, doesn't motivate them to learn. It can sometimes be discouraging. But there is a question in the chat from Julie, which says, would the ungrading approach be compatible with open pedagogy or vice versa? In parentheses, I barely understand myself what open pedagogy is.
So yeah, I love the idea of ungrading and open pedagogy, because open pedagogy is the idea of students as generators of content, as creators of content. So open pedagogy is doing stuff in your classrooms that are protected by the 5 R's of open, of Creative Commons, which is to reuse, revise, redistribute. And so open pedagogy is this idea that, for me, is taking those assignments that used to be disposable, that term disposable assignments, where I assign them in the LMS Canvas, the students do them and submit them into Canvas, and then they die at the end of the course because the Canvas course site goes away. Instead, I try to approach writing that students can own. And so I've found that using blogs helps them. So the blogs that they do are out into the world. Now, that's not open pedagogy, because I would have to ask them to put them under a Creative Commons license, but they're free to do that as well. A lot of open pedagogy is also where students collaborate, and whatever product they produce in the course, the professor puts it in some type of publication, like a press book, and puts it under a Creative Commons license. So it's out in the world, which is wonderful. I would love to do that. I haven't done that on that great of scale. So my small little foray into open pedagogy is having them do authentic writing that can be shared outside of the confines of the class.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation.
All right. I'm looking, I don't really see any other questions. I do see some different comments. I'm going to post throughout the presentation. I've been posting the link. I feel like I'm like this commercial that comes up every 5 minutes. So
thank you, Nadine, for doing that.
Yes, but are there any other questions? I want to open it up on the floor if you wish to ask a question. Any thoughts?
Nadine, I have a quick request. By means of a show of hands, could we find out how many of you self-identify as faculty and how many of you self-identify as administrators? This is sort of for the planners of our webinars, we're interested in this kind of information.
Oh, I'll open my mouth. Nadine knows I'm never quiet, so I identify as faculty. Actually, I identify as a learner. I usually, but they pay me like I'm a faculty member. So
yeah, it looks like we got a bunch of other folks in the chat, though. I think that knowing what I know of Dr. Carlson, that there's a lot of stuff today. I know she's very interested with the ungrading, and I think there's quite a few faculty here. I can speak on behalf of Prince George's, but the chat gives you all the detail. So
thank you.
And I did see one more question Wendy asked, and somebody seconded, and her question was, do you get pushback and how do you handle it from the administration?
Ah, yes. Part of my ability to survive in higher ed is to fly low under the radar. The problem is things like today where I'm talking more in a public forum, but I would say this, for me, in my experience, it's due to my privilege as a ranked professor at the college and the ability to have freedom to do what I want in my classrooms. I know that that's not always true for precarious adjuncts, for other faculty that are still moving through the ranks and all of that. So I definitely, I understand my privilege and I acknowledge it. The other thing that if the pushback that I normally would get is in the realm of two things, which are myths to me. So I take the feedback, the pushback, and it just rolls. One is academic rigor. Somehow there's this criticism that ungrading or gradeless classroom are unrigorous classrooms. And first of all, I challenge the term rigor and what it actually means and whether it has any place in education and learning, but that's just me. But I also talk about the idea that gradeless learning is not unstructured learning. There's structure in the class. There is this building, scaffolding of skills. There's a lot of feedback and resubmissions. And like I said, learning is labor to me. And it's not a transactional thing, but it is a very, very important thing. When we learn, we have to labor, we have to do something. There has to be evidence. So that's my first pushback. The second pushback is the whole idea of grade inflation. Everybody gets the A. And then I think grade inflation and concerns and the panic over grade inflation is based on this belief that grades were actually objective at one time and they actually were accurate, which I do not hold. So to me, grade inflation, if I have a dean or a chair calls me into their office and says, David, everyone's getting A's in your classes. And I'm going to say, well, didn't you hire me to do that? Isn't that success? Look at your mission statements on your institutions. It usually will say pathways to success or student success, all the success. When it happens, we should honor it. When it happens, we should celebrate it. When it happens, we should say, this person is doing something that is interesting. Maybe we should. So that's the pushback that I have. Again, I'm speaking from privilege. I'm speaking from a position where I can do whatever the hell I want. And I've been able to do that. No one's been pushing back on me on that. I don't fear for my job or anything like that, but I do understand that exists in some of our institutions. I will say this, in my personal experience, this reminds me of the biblical concept that a prophet is not accepted in his own land. And so when I do stuff like ungrading, I rarely get any of my colleagues to maybe one or two that I've converted. So I have understood that this is not for everyone. Even my own colleagues turn a blind eye to it. And I think that sometimes when they hear David, they roll their eyes and I'm just dismissed, which is fine. I'm still going to do my thing. I'm still going to have students come in and want to be in my class. And so I can show them, I guess, if you want to do data, which I think is all BS anyway, but if you want to look at data and you look at how my classes fill and their waiting lists for my class, and they can say, dismiss that by, well, they all want to get in your class because they know they can get an A. And I go, okay, fine. And so I don't push back. I don't take that personally. I've come to the point in my career where I know what's I feel is right, and I'm going to keep doing that. And if they want to see me as the grade inflator or the easy A, and that's why students love your class, fine. God bless. Go with God. Have good luck with your career. And that's how I do it. So I take a laissez-faire approach to any of the pushback, but I will engage in meaningful conversations about assessment. Absolutely. And I think grading has a place in that, because I am one person. I mean, you think about the whole educational system based on a farce on what these grades mean and GPA and all these AP and all this stuff, and all these companies that make billions of dollars off of the back of our students. Think of these plagiarism detectors, AI. Think of Turnitin. They're a $1 billion company based on what? Their databases are student writing. Did those students get paid for submitting their work to those databases? Absolutely not. So this is why I take that all out of my class. I can't say I trust my students if I'm going to have a plagiarism detector in my class. And so I'm sorry, I got on a soapbox there, but anyway, so that's the kind of pushback I normally will get.
Well, and David, thank you for that explanation. I know there is one more question in the chat, but I did want to, because I know we're close to time, at least put up the certificate so folks can, if they want to screenshot and make a copy. And then I'm going to pull the next question in the chat for you. So hold on, let me take a look here. And it said, so, what is a comment? I wonder if there's a correlation between emphasis on grades and some students in academic engagement and academic dishonesty. Through AI, I've observed an uptick in academic dishonesty with students since OpenAI, and they said they were faculty. And then someone asked, how receptive are your students to ungrading? Students tend to ask about when it will be graded, when I do activities without grades attached. And if I answer I won't be graded, some don't participate.
Yes, I forgot about that. That's a great one. If you don't grade it, they won't do it. I push back on that one as well. If I don't grade it, I'm giving the burden of ownership to them. And if they're going to own it, the chances are they're going to be internally motivated to do it. Now, I'm not going to lie. There will be students that I have this semester maybe that don't produce the labor. They just, they don't do it. What I normally will hear is, you took the stress off this class, and that helped me take the stress off the other classes that I had. That's beautiful to me. I love that. I'm gonna go, that's great. So I already understand that my class is probably going to be at the bottom of the list for many of my students. That's the first thing. So they don't have to worry about me. And I go ahead, relegate my class to your 5th thing to do on your to-do list. That's fine with me. As long as you, when you come to the class, your labor is focused, intense, and meaningful. So if you have that hour to devote to me, great. I want the best of your hour. If you can do that for me, that would be great. And so that's the kind of way that I see it. As far as I think the other thing about students, yeah, that's where my learning has really been focused. Where I fail the most is introducing the concept to my students. So I've been very intentional in my recent years of making sure that I have my students understand what I mean by a gradeless classroom, what I mean when I decenter the grade, and whether something is due or whatever. So what I normally will do is say, these are the best by due dates. If life happens, please let me know. That's the trust. If I trust you, you have to trust me. So I need you to trust me to say, David, I've, for a while now, it's been COVID or sickness. I didn't get to that assignment. And then it gives me the opportunity to say, I hope you're doing well. Focus on your health. My class should be the last thing on your list right now. It should be your recovery and rest. And just doing that, and I'm not saying that I don't mean it. I mean it. But that flips the switch in some students that say, he cares about me, so I'm going to care about the work in the class. And that's the number one thing. There was a study in Canada back in 2010 that talked about what are the characteristics that you think an effective professor has. The number one rated characteristic of the professor was respect. That professor respects me and the unique challenges I have as a college student. So a lot of what I guess my approach to answer this question is, it's building relationships of trust. It's trying to coax the students to trust me, but also not pulling the rug out from under them. I'm not going to promise them something and then at the end go, oh, by the way, bait and switch. I just baited you and now I'm going to switch and sell you this bad mattress instead of the mattress that I promised you, or the car. It's none of that. It's I follow my word as best as I can. And I say, we're going to have an assessment conversation where you have a voice. So I hope that answered that question.
All right. I don't see any other questions. I do see a comment. This can show how students perform in future classes. If you create a culture of learning, students incorporate it into their learning.
Excellent. Great comment. Yeah. It's transfer. I love it. It's awesome.
All right, we are at 11 o'clock. I do know I'm going to put the link out in the chat one more time that provides those resources in case folks didn't get that. I want to thank you for coming to this presentation, and a special thank you to David for sharing what he is working on and some of the challenges, and also how he tries to work with others and things that have been encountered. So thank you so much, David. I'm sure this will probably be one of many webinars that David continues to do on this topic. So thank you.
Thanks, Nadine.